All right, thanks for stopping by the channel to check out our Too Hot for TikTok special that I teased on TikTok, and maybe that's how you found it. Maybe you found it through a search on YouTube. I want to say before I get started that this is going to be a speculative theory about why Brent Kopacka traveled to Lewiston, Idaho. Actually, he traveled to Clarkston, Idaho, but you had to pass through Lewiston, Idaho. And I want to make the Lewiston, Idaho connection because when I saw this, I thought to myself, there's no way I can't look into this and there's no way I can't ask the question. Now, the problem is that I was also brought to my attention tonight about how internet sleuths such as myself are ruining people's lives because we make allegations, we suggest people are involved in things without any proof of such matters, and we ruin lives. I want to counter that in a couple of things before I get started. I'm going to name names. I'm going to name very specific names and a very specific theory, a very questionable set of questions to ask, and all these are our questions. This is theory crafting, this is true crime, and whenever you're talking about theories, it's going to cause uncomfortable questions. I want to point out that in a defense case, for example, the defense is doing the same thing that I'm doing. They're trying to find reasonable doubt for their client, that there's some other explanation of what's happening, and that's all I'm doing here. If it's allowed in a court of law to present a reasonable doubt, it also should be allowed by us quote-unquote internet sleuths. So I apologize up front that what I'm about to say is going to be extremely controversial and it could potentially hurt people whose families are maybe going to be named here, friends are going to be named here, and I apologize for that. What I don't apologize for is asking questions, and that's all I'm doing is asking questions. So if it bothers your consciousness for me to ask questions and difficult questions of somebody whose brother, sister, mother, whatever may be implicated, if that bothers you, then check out now. If you want to hear the details, then stay tuned. I'm going to try to go through this as much as possible to explain a new set of questions that came up that I can't let go. One of the things that's bothered me from the very beginning of this case was why supposedly Brent Kopacka went on this weird route down to Clarkston, Washington, through Lewiston, Idaho, and back up again to Pullman the day of the murders. It was my guess at the time that if Kopacka had done these things, he was ditching somewhere along the line the murder weapon and the clothes. And that's what I assumed must have been happening. But I didn't understand why all the way down to Lewiston, Idaho, Clarkston, Washington, which by the way are separated by a river. And I'm going to show that here in a little bit. I used to be on this campus. I know the area pretty well. And so I'm going to show you in maps how it lays out. But one thing you need to understand is that Washington and Idaho are separated, and right on each side of the river there is Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington. They're separated by a bridge in between. Those two cities touch each other. According to the official timeline, the day of the murders of the Idaho Four, when Brent Kopacka allegedly had murdered 4 people in their home on November 13th, later that day, Brent Kopacka allegedly went back to his residence in Pullman, then went back to the scene of the crime sometime that morning, and then drove this very weird circuitous route down through Lewiston, Idaho, across the river into Clarkston, and then back through Lewiston again and up a different route to get back to Pullman at his campus. What he was doing on that trip has never been explained, and I think that the questions I have now are really starting to come together as a potential set of questions that must be investigated. And again, I apologize because this is going to name names and it's going to come close to home for people. It's not my intention to hurt anyone. It's my intention to ask the question, because that's what we need to ask. For a reasonable doubt, we have to ask, was Brent Kopacka the murderer, or was Brent Kopacka simply the getaway man, the driver? And that's what this is going to show, is that Brent Kopacka may have actually been the driver for other conspirators who went into the house and committed the murders. If you keep in mind the timing of the events, according to what we have, and I want to point out something about the vehicle. From what I understand, and I verified this online by asking the question several different ways, The video footage of the white Hyundai Elantra that we believe belongs to Bryan Kohberger arriving at the scene and leaving the scene, all that video footage is too grainy and too low quality to say with certainty who's in the car or how many people are in the car. This is important. I have verified this multiple times. The video footage of that vehicle, all the times that it's caught on camera, all the places that it's seen, it is too low quality, too grainy to tell who's driving and how many people are in the car. This is important because as a theory is starting to come out that there may have been multiple conspirators who went into the house and committed the murders, and that Bryan Kohberger could actually have been simply in his car waiting for someone to return to the car to drive them away from the scene after the murders were done. That's the possibility. There is the lack of evidence, from what I understand, that there was more than one or only one person in the vehicle. So for those who want to maintain it's just Kohberger, even so, there could have been somebody laying down in the back seat. But from what I understand, the official news reports are saying the video footage is too grainy for us to tell how many people are in the car. So could there have been other people in the car, or at least one other person in the car with Bryan Kohberger during the commission of these murders? Did Bryan Kohberger get out of the car? From what I understand as well, there is no video placing Bryan Kohberger getting out of the car or getting back into the car. We see the car on cameras. We do not see, from what I understand, we do not see Bryan Kohberger exiting the vehicle or getting back into the vehicle. We see the vehicle. So we don't know that Bryan Kohberger didn't stay in the vehicle, from what I understand. Now here's where it gets crazy. A lot of people have pointed out that there's another individual that is super interesting in this case, and that's who we're going to talk about today, is this individual known as Brent Kopacka. So you probably knew where this was going. If you followed this case, you know Brent Kopacka. Maybe you searched for it on YouTube and that's how you found this video. And I apologize to the friends and family of Brent Kopacka, because these questions are not going to be something that you will appreciate. And I understand that that can cause you emotional duress. From what I understand, one of his best friends, who I will be talking about in this video today, has commented that he couldn't handle watching all the people accuse his friend of being involved in this murder, and he had to shut it off. So my hope is that he is still shutting off social media, not watching and not dealing with his friend being allegedly accused of anything. And I want to point out one more time, if I need to make it so clear, I am not accusing Brent Kopacka or his family of being involved in this event. What I'm asking is difficult questions and showing how it may have been possible. And that's what we're going to ask: does the Brent Kopacka scenario explain exactly why Bryan Kohberger went down to Lewiston, Idaho? And I think it's shocking to think about that this may explain exactly why Bryan Kohberger went down to Lewiston, Idaho and doubled back after hitting Clarkston, through Lewiston, Idaho, and back up to Pullman via a different route. So let's get into this. This, by the way, is our timeline on our website, devilsadvocates.info. There's a timeline section. By the way, my phone's going off beside me. I'm sorry about that. There's a timeline section you can see at the top, and there's timelines for Luigi Mangione, there's P. Diddy, and there's Bryan Kohberger. This is the Bryan Kohberger, and it goes way up. It's got all the details about the murder. The murders took place of the four individuals on November 13th, 2022. We're going to start at December 14, 2022. This is 1 month and 1 day after the murders. Now, why is that important to me? What's interesting is several things happened exactly 1 month after the murders. Bryan Kohberger, at some point, either on the 13th, which would be exactly 1 month after the murders, or on the 14th, maybe basically 1 month and 1 day after the murders, he decides at that point to head back to his family home in Pennsylvania. It is my understanding that his father had come out somehow. I'm assuming he flew out, though I haven't been able to verify this. Met up with his son in Pullman, and then the two of them drove back in Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra back to Pennsylvania, which was a 2,500 mile trip. Okay, and they were driving together, and they got stopped a couple times by law enforcement on the way. That's going to lead into some of this interesting theory as well. So hear me out. So Bryan Kohberger would have left somewhere around the 13th of December, exactly 1 month after the murders. By the way, Bryan Kohberger was continuing to go to classes after the murders. So it's interesting to think about, if he did do the killings, that he had enough wherewithal to continue to go to classes and show up for school and all these things, business as usual, and it doesn't seem to have registered to anybody that anything was off. He did have some issues with run-ins with his professor over basically harshly grading females' papers, but and that's in this timeline as well, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. What we're going to focus on is Bryan Kohberger deciding to leave exactly 1 month after the event, and then this interesting individual by the name of Brent Kopacka, who also is in Pullman 1 month and 1 day after the event. So let's start here. Again, there's a lot of interesting things in this timeline, but what we're really going to focus on at first is right here. At 8:37 p.m. on the night of the 14th. At this point, by the way, either Bryan Kohberger and his father were traveling to Pullman, from Pullman to Albrightville, Pennsylvania, to their home residence on the 13th, or it was on the 14th. We're not quite sure. But on the 14th at 8:37 p.m., Pullman police officers are called to the scene of a weapons offense at 1000 block Southeast Latah Street in Pullman. The address is basically of apartment number 311A. This has been verified in police reports. This has been verified online by the actual police dispatch that I listened to and confirmed the address. 311A and Coffee House Apartments, which is just according to my timeline, it's 1.5 miles away from where Bryan Kohberger lived. I think it's actually more like 2. Let me pull that up for you. Nope, that's not the one. This is the one right here. So in this map, this is up here at the top is where Bryan Kohberger lived at the time of the murders. Down here is where Brent Kopacka was at on the night of December 14th, a month later. This distance is shown here as 2 miles. An article that I read said it's 1.5 miles. Maybe the route that's being taken here is a little longer than it needs to be, or actually, as the bird flies, as they say, as the crows fly, it's probably 1.5 miles, but by driving distance, it's 2. The point being is that they lived relatively, or they were allegedly living relatively close to each other, within a couple of miles. So does that mean Bryan Kohberger knows Brent Kopacka? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Does it mean that he could have? Sure. Pullman's a small place and they didn't live that far away. But let's get back to the timeline. So that night at 8:37 p.m., 1 month after the murders, Pullman police are called to the scene of a weapons offense. There's roommates, supposedly, of Brent Kopacka, who is a Army veteran who had been suffering from PTSD, and he had a gun and he was threatening to kill his roommates, allegedly. This started a police standoff with Brent Kopacka. And this is reported on the Daily Evergreen. As you can see, there's sources here where I list the Daily Evergreen. Let's take a look, by the way, at that real quick. This is the Daily Evergreen. Man threatens to kill his roommates, shot by SWAT Thursday morning. So what you'll find out is Brent Kopacka was shot and killed by SWAT, or law enforcement, Pullman law enforcement, the morning of the 15th. So it started with a standoff at 8:37 p.m. on the 14th. This is right after Bryan Kohberger leaves the area to go back to his home. And now we have this situation in which Brent Kopacka, which many people believe was potentially involved in this crime, and we're going to explain why. What I'm saying is could have happened, is how we don't know anything about these roommates. One oddity I want to point out of this is Bryan Kopacka, who was shot and killed this morning on December 15th, was 36 years old at the time. He was not attending WSU. There's no public records that Bryan Kopacka lived or worked anywhere in Pullman. There was no records of his work history there. There is no real records that he even lived there, per se. In fact, one of the really interesting things that's going to come out in this discussion as we get through it is that Brent Kopacka didn't even have any furniture in his room. when his best friend is on YouTube. I've got a clip of that. I don't have it. Maybe I have it linked here. His friend Darren basically confirmed that when his family went to the apartment, to the room that Brent was supposed to be staying in, there was no bed, there was no dresser. The only things that were in the room that supposedly he was staying in was some broken computer equipment, a broken safe, and his Army discharge papers. That to me doesn't sound like a person who's living there. Where is he going to sleep? On the floor? How long had he been there? We don't know. What I'm suggesting in the theory that I'm asking questions about is, was Brent Kopacka even really living there? Or was he just crashing there? Was he sleeping on the floor? Is it really his apartment? And were they really his roommates, or is something else going on? There's a scenario in which I can see, and it'll make a lot more sense coming up here shortly, in which a group of conspirators, perhaps we could ask, was Brent Kopacka involved in this? A group of conspirators had decided to do this thing in Moscow for whatever reason. And there are people online who have many reasons why the victims were targeted. The most interesting one perhaps is one by Jay Embry that I see often, that two of the females in the house were the actual victims, the actual targeted victims, and that the boyfriend of one of the women and a friend of another of the victims were simply collateral damage. That two girls were actually the target of the hit, and that it was potentially related to some kind of drug issue in which their parents had gotten involved in drugs, were potentially in some kind of convoluted thing going to rat out on some people, and therefore the girls were basically eliminated as some kind of payback or threat to shut your mouth kind of thing. Now, I don't know that any of that is true, but what it does is it leads to this question as to who was really targeted in the house. And this is one of the other things I want to point out before we get, again, we're going to get into Brent Kopacka in detail, and I'm sorry this is taking so long, but it really requires a lot of thought process through. One of the things that I've asked many times is, Bryan Kohberger supposedly did this 4 murders on 2 different floors of a 3-floor story building, within 15 minutes. So he parks the car, he gets out, he goes into the house with, by the way, 6 people there, 2 surviving roommates and 4 victims. He kills 4 people, allegedly, on 2 separate floors, manages to change clothes, according to some, or he would have been covered in blood because it was a fixed blade knife that was the attacks. It was all stabbings. You have to imagine that there would be an enormous amount of blood at the scene. So somehow this individual is able to get into the house, murder 4 people on 2 separate floors, get back out of the house and into his vehicle without leaving an absolute bloodbath between the house and his car or in his car. You have to understand, his vehicle, which wasn't really fully looked into until a month later, there was no DNA found of blood in the car that we know of. None. That is almost unfathomable. If Bryan Kohberger had gone in and physically murdered 4 people with a knife, there's just no way DNA is not getting transferred to the car, unless Bryan Kohberger never got out of the car and Bryan Kohberger was a driver. Because again, all we know for certain, according to the official reports, is that Bryan Kohberger switched his phone off somewhere in Pullman before driving to Moscow, Idaho. His vehicle looks like it appears on the scene shortly before the attack, is seen speeding away at a high rate of speed after the attack. We don't have proof that Bryan Kohberger got out of the car. There's an issue of DNA inside of the house. We know that, right? A speck of touch DNA, not blood of Bryan Kohberger, not hair of Bryan Kohberger, a speck of touch DNA on a knife sheath, which, by the way, just as an aside, and I know people have a hard time believing that police plant evidence or anything like that, but just hear it out. As an aside, that sheath that was found sometime later after the victims were initially found. So there's a report by the police that indicate that the victims were found, and then later on, they found a sheath laying beside the bed. When that sheath showed up and how it got there is going to be potentially a big part of this case. When did the sheath show up? And again, it doesn't have blood, it doesn't have hair, it doesn't have saliva, it has touch DNA, which allegedly relates to Bryan Kohberger. It should also be pointed out that that touch DNA, according to the defense of Bryan Kohberger, was obtained illegally. What they claimed was law enforcement had used 2 ancestry websites to submit samples from that touch DNA, the very, very small piece that was left. They sent it to 2 ancestry websites to see if they could get a hereditary link, ancestry or whatever. And both websites that the law enforcement used were strictly forbidding law enforcement from using those websites for that purpose. It is strictly forbidden for them to do so. Therefore, according to the defense, the DNA match that they used to say that Bryan Kohberger somehow relates to that touch DNA was obtained illegally. Law enforcement is not allowed to use those ancestry sites. They only have one site apparently that they can use. They did not use that. They used 2 other sites that they are not allowed to use. And so the defense is saying you can't use this DNA evidence because you didn't obtain it legally. Now, some people who are diehard guilters who say Bryan is guilty don't give a shit whether it was discovered legally or not. They're like, give him the chair. His DNA was there. I don't give a shit whether you obtained it legally or not. Well, I'm sorry, that's not how our legal system works. If you discover something through illegal means, you can't bring it into court. It's called fruit of the poisonous tree in unofficial terms. Anything that you obtain illegally cannot be admitted in court. So if it is agreed by the judge, and it may not, the judge may not agree and he may allow it to come into court, but if the judge agrees that that was not obtained legally, then that DNA evidence placing Bryan Kohberger inside the house won't exist. And I want to point out another thing, and I realize this is super long, but all we know is that a piece of touch DNA that had Bryan Kohberger's print apparently, or whatever touch DNA on it, was on a sheath inside the house. It does not prove Bryan Kohberger was in the house. What it proves is somebody placed or left it there. In fact, the actual police affidavit talking about it says that it was a sheath was placed beside the bed. That's the wording they used. That was the police's own word. It wasn't discarded. It doesn't say, the police say that the killer discarded or left behind a sheath. The wording was a sheath was placed near the bodies beside the bed. Placed by who? This is going to be a massive question. Placed by who and when? If Bryan Kohberger, in this question series that we're asking, was a getaway driver for conspirators who went in, and I would suggest there's a possibility, more so today than I've ever realized, that 2 conspirators at least went into the house and did the killings on both floors at the same time. This would increase the likelihood that the job would get done, and it would get done quickly, and they would get in and out in 15 minutes. Bryan Kohberger may have never left the car. And in fact, I want to point out a thing about the 15 minutes thing. The only reason we believe the murders are done in 15 minutes is because the car is seen going to the place and showing up and then leaving at a high rate of speed, and that window is about 16 minutes, 15 minutes, somewhere around there. That's the reason why we believe the murders were all done in 15 minutes. What is possible, as Jay Embry, for example, on YouTube, when he's covering it, has suggested, is it doesn't mean that there wasn't still an assailant or whatever inside the house, a suspect inside the house. Maybe one of the multiple people who entered the house, if that theory is correct, maybe one of them came out and sped away with Bryan Kohberger, if Bryan Kohberger was driving the car. It's always possible that somebody else was driving Bryan Kohberger's car. So we don't know for sure, because again, the video footage on who was driving the vehicle, from what I understand, was too grainy to determine who's driving or how many people are in the car. So again, there's a possibility based on this scenario that we don't know that there weren't 2 or 3 people in the car that showed up, that multiple people didn't get out. We don't know that Bryan Kohberger got out. We don't know that Bryan Kohberger was in the car. All we know is that there's a sheath that was placed at the scene that has touch DNA from Bryan Kohberger. Am I hitting this enough? Are you understanding that that's a possible thing? This is a scenario that's going to come up. This is what defense teams are going to do, is they're going to ask, how can you know that the Bryan Kohberger was in the house? First of all, you may not even get to admit that evidence. So let's move on, because I'm beating a dead horse, right? So this is talking about the standoff. Now, here's what's really super interesting to me as well. At 3:02 in the morning, WSU apparently sent out a notice to all staff or all students, probably via a text messaging system to their phones. I used to go to school there, so I'm familiar with those kind of situations where if something's happening on campus, everybody gets a text message. Students were sent a text message that I believe this is a quote from one of the articles that we were researching. SWAT is actively working, this is the quote, SWAT is actively working on the south side of campus, shelter in place until further notice. Note, nowhere in that notice to students does it say anything about a shooting. It just says SWAT is actively working on the south side of campus, shelter in place until further notice. This is important because I want to point out that when Brent Kopacka is stopped with his father on the way back to their home in Pennsylvania, his father mentions that they are aware of a shooting that took place on campus. And the officer says, today? And they're like, yes. So how did Brent Kopacka's father know that there was a shooting on campus when the notice that went out to students at 3:02 was that SWAT was working on the south side of campus, and also that and then later, it says about an hour later, the shooting actually of Brent Kopacka happened at 4:22. So about an hour later, we'll say it was after 4:22 after they shot him. It says Pullman PD have resolved the situation adjacent to the WSU Pullman campus and have declared an all clear. Resume normal campus operations. Nowhere in these two quoted statements that the school sent out says anything about a shooting. Now, one could argue Brent Kopacka may have known about something going on at the school when they were driving back, because on his phone while they're driving back home to Pennsylvania, he gets text alerts saying, hey, there's some kind of thing going on and SWAT's on campus. But notice, in these statements, if these are indeed the quoted statements that went to students, there is no mention of a shooting, but that the father will say there was a mass shooting, I think he said mass shooting, at my son's school at WSU. And they're like, today? They're like, yes. So they're talking about the shooting of Brent Kopacka. So after about 7 or 8 hours of a standoff from earlier that night, the night before at 8:37 p.m., right up here, at 4:22 a.m., the standoff ends when Brent Kopacka, sorry about that, I keep interposing these names. And notice it's BK. It's Brent Kopacka, Brent Kopacka, BK. It's kind of very strange. But anyways, at 7:22 in the morning, 7 to 8 hours after negotiations with law enforcement, Brent is basically shot and killed. It says that he had been firing his gun when police responded and shot and killed Kopacka in return. Whether he was shooting at police or not is unclear. It lists the officer here who shot him and killed him. It was Sergeant Brent Boyd. And this is he that was 36 years old is referring to Brent Kopacka. It is interesting, if Brent Kopacka does not have a work location in Pullman, that he would be staying and living as a 36-year-old man with college students. Most college students are younger than this, so it begs the question, what is Brent Kopacka doing rooming with a couple of young college students, presumably, who were at this place? It leads to a lot of questions. And also, as I pointed out, we're not sure there was even any furniture of Brent Kopacka, so we're not entirely sure that he was really living there. It got reported that he was in some kind of dispute with his roommates. What may have happened in this theory is that he was in an argument or dispute with other individuals at that residence. Whether or not he lived there or staying there or was visiting there, he was in a dispute with residents that lived at that residence. He may not have been an actual roommate of those residents. There's a theory that suggests in this whole idea that Brent Kopacka and others returned for kind of a get-together 1 month after the crime. This is 1 month and 1 day. So 1 month after the crime, the individuals get together perhaps, and they're going over things that happened in this event. And maybe that exchange gets heated between the conspirators. Somebody's having second thoughts, somebody's thinking about that. And now maybe, and this is pure speculation, now maybe Brent Kopacka says, I'll fucking kill you if you think you're going to come out and say that. And then all of a sudden it gets fucking volatile, right? All of a sudden it's like, oh shit, this guy's going to kill us. A report goes in that this roommate is threatening to kill them. SWAT comes in. The roommates apparently get out of the house, leaving only Brent Kopacka in the house to be shot and killed after a 7 or 8 hour standoff. I want to point out as well that there are all kinds of other sketchy things. This is the big thing right here. Brent Kopacka's best friend, Darren Duncan, again, went on the internet with the podcaster and was talking about this event. And he was kind of defending his friend's honor, how it was sad that people keep suggesting that Brent Kopacka is involved in this kind of murder kind of thing. But he did state some things that were pretty freaking shocking, of which he revealed that when the family went to their son's room after the shooting, his room was empty except for and it had no furniture, but his cell phone was left on the kitchen counter and had been factory reset. Now, think about this for a minute. Why the F is his phone factory reset? So, did Brent Kopacka reset his phone in the middle of a standoff with the police because he didn't want them seeing what was on his phone? Did, as some people have suggested, the actual police factory reset his phone? Darren himself, who's friend of Brent Kopacka, theorized that law enforcement may have actually believed that Brent Kopacka was involved in the murder of the 4 in Idaho because it was only about 20 minutes away from where this happened, where this shooting happened, and that they may have gone there thinking that this might have been the guy involved in that murder, and maybe they were on high alert and high edge, and that led to them accidentally shooting and killing a man that they thought was involved in the Idaho 4 murders. And then when they realized their oh shit moment, this is Darren's speculation, his best friend, allegedly his best friend, when they realized that their oh shit moment, that they killed a guy that wasn't related to the Idaho 4 murders, they wiped his phone, they being the police. That was Brent's best friend Darren who suggested that. And I feel bad because I understand that Darren is having some emotional stress from all the online sleuths that are accusing his friend Brent of being involved, but it was Brent himself who suggested that the law enforcement may have assumed that he was involved in the murder. So that's from Darren himself. And that in their zealousness of trying to get the guy, or thinking he's super dangerous because he just murdered 4 people a month ago, shot and killed him and went, oh shit, this guy wasn't involved, and tried to cover their tracks. So again, I apologize for the stress that the family's going through and the friends are going through, but they themselves have speculated on it. So we're going to speculate on it as well. During the trip, we talked about how Bryan Kohberger was pulled over twice within 10 minutes on Interstate 70 east of Indianapolis. And there's a YouTube video that's linked right here on our website of the traffic stop where the police officer he comes up to the passenger side and he leans in and he's talking to Bryan Kohberger's dad. Bryan Kohberger leans over his dad and looks through the window to talk to the officer, and they have a brief discussion caught on camera in which Bryan Kohberger mentions that they had just been stopped just a few minutes earlier by another vehicle, another law enforcement with an SUV. The officer said, "We don't have any SUVs." Oh, well, it must have been another agency, so you got stopped by state police or whatever. So there was a discussion about this, but that's when the father says, so Bryan Kohberger had been stopped earlier, by the way, for speeding. This time he was stopped for following too close behind a semi. So maybe he's in a hurry to get out of there, to get out of Pullman. Him and his dad are driving. I imagine they've been driving probably for 12 hours. This is how far away they are from Pullman at this point, 12 hours from Pullman. So did they leave on the night that the shooting happened, on the 14th of December when that standoff began to happen? Was that the same night they left, and had they been driving for 12 straight hours? Or did they stop somewhere? I don't know. We don't know the timing exactly. It's not in any official records. But the point being is that during that stop, it's really interesting to note that the father says that there was a shooting at the son's campus. How did he know that? According to what we showed earlier, the statements that went out notifying the students of the situation was that SWAT was actively working on the south side of campus. There's no mention of a shooter there, and that the Pullman PD have resolved the situation and it's all clear. No mention of a shooting. So how did the dad know that there was a shooting on campus? I might theorize in my questions if somebody called Brent Kopacka to let him know that someone had been shot and killed. Or specifically that Brent Kopacka had been shot and killed. Because is it possible Brian knew who he was? Is it possible that there's a group of conspirators? And again, I'm going to tie Brent Kopacka to Brent Kopacka in the Lewiston, Idaho connection here in just a few minutes. So let's go a little further. On the 6th, so okay, actually we're, let's see. Yeah, on the 16th, they noticed that when they were returning to Pennsylvania, witnesses recall seeing Brian and his father at an auto repair shop in Pennsylvania where they dropped off the car to get serviced. I find that interesting as well. What was that about? So they're just pulling in. It's interesting also to note that on the 17th, it says they arrived at their home in the Pocono Mountains. And so this is what's confusing to me. On the 16th, supposedly they're back at the house and checking in their car to an auto body shop to be checked out. Which again, if the car is covered in blood at this point, this makes no sense to me. So follow this logic. There's a story that says that just before his arrest, Brent Kopacka is seen at his parents' residence wearing latex gloves and cleaning his car. Okay, and that he's bagging things up in little sandwich baggies or little plastic baggies, and that he put these items in a neighbor's trash can. That's the story. If there's still cleanup to do on that vehicle, then why are they dropping it off at an auto repair shop before that car can be cleaned? So I'm just confused about the timing of when it happened. Because if this happened on the 16th that they're back at the family home, or is it on the 17th when they're back on the family home? Two different sources are cited. You can read them themselves. Maybe you can figure out the mystery of what happened there. All right, so I think for the most part we're through this part, but now we're gonna talk about Jay Embry's theory a little bit, and we're going to talk about the Moscow, Idaho / Lewiston, Idaho situation for the big coup de grace at the end. That's going to be holy shit. Did that just happen? I don't know. Let's think about this. So let's first go to a recap a bit what happened after the murders. Allegedly, Brent Kopacka returns to his house or his campus at Pullman. And then later that morning around 9 a.m. So the murders, by the way, took place between 4:04 or 4:05 to 4:20 in the morning. So he returns, leaves Pullman again, and returns to Moscow, Idaho, sometime in 9-ish time frame. I think that's going to be in here somewhere on my timeline, but I'm not going to highlight it at the moment. So he returns somewhere that morning to the crime scene, and then continues on this route down to Clarkston, Washington, going through Moscow, or not Moscow, but Lewiston, Idaho. You must, on the route that he took, you must pass through Lewiston, Idaho to get to Clarkston. Why am I making a big deal about this? Well, I'm going to explain it here now. Let me show you this route. This is a view of what is on the Lewiston Tribune's Facebook page, and it shows Kopacka's alleged movements that day. You'll see that he's here at the Pullman campus at 2:42 in the morning. Supposedly goes over here at step 3 on the timeline around 3:29 to 4:20. This is when the murders take place. Showing up at the place, just before, just about 4:05, somewhere around there. And then the murders are done by 4:20, leaving a window of about 15 to 16 minutes in which it's done. And then returns to campus. So he goes here, and then he comes back here. So you'll see the 1, 2, 3 to Moscow, and then back at 5. So somewhere his cell phone pinged somewhere at 4 here, but then it's 5 back here, 6 up here, and then 6 again right here. So there's this back and forth from Moscow to Pullman, right? So where it gets interesting is then later on in the morning at 9:92 in the morning, Bryan Kohberger apparently returns to Moscow, Idaho again, right up in here. And then takes this interesting trip down here and has his cell phone pinged here and ends up down here in Clarkston and has his cell phone pinged in Clarkston. From there, the official timeline says, he then came back through Lewiston, Idaho, and back up through this route. If you can follow my mouse, it's pretty small on the screen, on the left-hand side, coming up 195. So it went down Highway 95 into Lewiston and Clarkston, and then back through Lewiston and Clarkston, and then back up 195 to Pullman. And I have always asked myself, why this route? What happened? Again, I assumed that maybe if he was the killer, he's discarding the knife somewhere along the route. There's a lot of road there. There's a lot of places to go. By the way, at the Devil's Advocates, my buddy and I, my partner who runs this channel, we're going to drive this route. We're going to drive this route and either do it live and talk to you about it as we're doing it, or we'll just drive and recreate and cut the best minutes because it's going to be a bit of a drive. But either way, we're planning on doing this drive pretty soon. But this is where I also have to make an interesting point. So I was asking myself, why Lewiston, Clarkston? And apparently, by the way, we know Bryan Kohberger was down in Clarkston because he was caught on camera at an Albertsons. So he was pinged at a gas station, basically on a surveillance camera that caught him in Clarkston driving past a coffee shop, I believe it was. And so that we know he was there, but his vehicle was there. We could sees his car there. And then they allegedly see Kohberger himself shopping in Albertsons on the in-store cameras doing some shopping. And then he leaves Clarkston, goes back through Lewiston and back up through Pullman. Here's the kicker, the shocker, the one I almost hate saying because I feel so bad for the family and for the friends because it's just questions. But Brent Kopacka's mother lives still, as far as I understand, to this day in Lewiston, Idaho, and did at the time. So if people like Jay Embry are correct and there's multiple conspirators, you have the possibility that, follow the logic here, that Brent Kopacka didn't actually live in Pullman. Maybe he lived down in Lewiston with his family. And maybe he was just crashing for a couple nights up in Pullman. And this is why this room that he was supposedly staying in has nothing. No bed, no dresser, no clothes, only some broken down electronic equipment, a broken safe, and some discharge paper from the military, which is very interesting. That's all that's there. So where was he staying? Was he living in that apartment, or was he just reconvening in Pullman, perhaps with multiple conspirators, a month after the event, to kind of go over events? And did things get heated and there was this whole argument about, I'll fucking kill you if you say anything about this, or something to that effect? Again, pure speculation. But let's think about this route. The night of the murders, a month earlier, Kohberger allegedly goes from Pullman to Moscow and back to Pullman again. And in between that time, he shuts off his phone and he goes to commit the murders and go back to Pullman. Then later that morning, he supposedly gets back in the car, drives back to Moscow to kind of cruise the crime scene, is what they're alleging, but maybe not. Because to get to Lewiston, Idaho, you need to kind of go through Moscow unless you go this other route. So the question becomes, was Brent Kopacka living in Lewiston, Idaho with his family, perhaps, and was just up in Pullman temporarily? And during the commission of the murders, did Bryan Kohberger drop off Brent Kopacka at the crime scene, and he and others could have been involved? And again, I apologize. I'm not trying to say that Brent Kopacka did the crime. I'm asking, does this scenario lend a possibility? And even more so, after the murders have been committed and Bryan Kohberger comes back to Pullman, potentially with the suspect, maybe Brent Kopacka, in the car, speeding off from the crime scene, goes back to drop Brent Kopacka back off at his home in Lewiston, Idaho. So they go back through Moscow, cruising by the crime scene, checking out to see if anything's going on. Is any law enforcement on the scene? Which, by the way, no, they are not yet. They don't find those bodies until around noonish, I believe. So in the morning, there hasn't been activity. They drive back past the crime scene, and then under this theory, does Kohberger then drive Brent Kopacka back down to his family residence or wherever he's staying in Lewiston, Idaho, where his mother lives? So again, you can look this stuff up. I don't want anyone to bother his mother, Darcy, who lives in Lewiston. I will tell you that her last name has been changed. So she apparently married or something. And so she's going by Darcy Nixon, I believe now, but it was Darcy Kopacka. You can verify that easily on the internet that Darcy Kopacka is the mother of Brent Kopacka and lives in Lewiston, Idaho. Please do not bother this woman. Do not bother their family. Do not go do anything stupid. I am not asking anyone to do that, nor am I saying that Brent Kopacka was in the house and committed the murders or was involved. But I am asking, is it possible? Does this scenario make sense? That 1 month after the events, after the murders, 1 month after the events, in which it appears that it's possible Bryan Kohberger simply was a getaway driver for other people. And by the way, I didn't hit this very hard. Jay Embry has some videos. I don't know where he got it. He has an unbelievable video that appears to be time-stamped from like 3:45 in the morning, right before the murders take place, in which an individual can be heard racking a gun and seen walking towards the King residence where the murders take place in just a very short period of time. He also has video footage from people's outdoor cameras of their garage area, which alleges to show an individual hanging out and stationed by the house and another by a garbage can. There's indications in these videos, and I can't verify them, but because I don't know where the hell he got those videos. Great on him, I guess, if they're legit, but I can't verify they're legit. But if it's true that those videos are showing what they show what looks like multiple conspirators showing up and staging around the King residence where the murders take place at the crucial time. 3:45, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then he says you see the white Elantra come into the scene, do some turnarounds, stop nearby, and then speeds off 15 minutes later, after apparently the deed has been done. But there's no proof, as far as I know, Bryan Kohberger ever got out of the car, other than the DNA that's in the house, which again, we don't know who placed that sheath there. And I don't know how you explain the lack of blood all over the place that would have had to have been just impossible to clean up. So I don't understand how any of that makes sense, that Bryan Kohberger went into a virtual bloodbath and somehow, even if he could change clothes, isn't dripping something somewhere. Shoes, clothes, he would have been dripping in blood, in my opinion. Unless it didn't happen in just 15 minutes. Somebody else had more time to change out of clothes and get out of stuff. And when they got back into his car, they were clean. They had taken off their clothes. And somebody else helped remove stuff. And again, it sounds crazy. It sounds out there. But when a defense is working their case, they're going to be asking the same kind of question. Is there a reasonable doubt? In my opinion, it's really interesting. And I think a jury would find it interesting too. Why did Bryan Kohberger drive down to Lewiston, Idaho? What is the Brent Kopacka connection and his family living in Lewiston, Idaho? Was Brent Kopacka being dropped back off and at his family residence or some such place down in Lewiston, Idaho? So that's going to conclude my analysis for today. Thank you for watching basically the too hot for TikTok. I don't know how long this video has gone. I didn't check the timing on it, but it seems like it's been forever. I probably could have done it quicker. Maybe I'll clean it up a little bit in editing. But in any case, these are things that we certainly won't be able to say on TikTok. I want to say also as a closing that I think we're going to get okay on YouTube to talk about it. Again, Jay Embry talks about shit and names people left and right and hasn't been kicked off, and he's got a way bigger following than we do. So we can hope that that's going to be the case. Also, when I was reading this article talking about how internet sleuths should be ashamed of themselves for causing stress on families and implicating people who are innocent. First of all, if Bryan Kohberger didn't commit the murders, then we don't know what to make of that. We don't even know for sure in this scenario whether he just stumbled upon the crime scene in the middle of the night and had nothing to do with it and just took off because of a guilty conscience. Like, holy shit, if I'm here when this comes out, they're going to think I did it. Who knows? There's a lot of scenarios. So claiming that somebody's innocent and somebody else isn't is playing judge and jury with the situation. But anyways, what I was going with that, the last thing is that YouTube apparently does not tend to take down videos that make defamation of character comments. Like, this might be seen as a defamation of character. I am not trying to defame Brent Kopacka or his family. I am not saying that Brent Kopacka did the murder or was at the house that night. But we do have to ask the question, what was going on 1 month almost on the anniversary of the murders? And why did it result in Brent Kopacka being killed? And what happened the night of the murders, the day of the murders, when Bryan Kohberger, for some reason, goes down to Lewiston, Idaho and back? For what? For what? It remains a mystery. Thanks for listening. Give us your thoughts. I'm curious to see what you think.